Hi, hello everyone. Welcome to another book discussion with the Swedenborgian online community, your interfaith affirming spiritual community, uplifting you and each other wherever we are, spiritually and physically. So I hope you're doing well today. It's nice to connect with you. To further connect, as you probably know, you can always visit Swedenborgiancommunity.org. Send us your suggestions, your feedback, get involved with the community and conversation. Speaking of conversation, hello everyone in the chatzy. It's nice to see all of you turning out today. Are you excited for another book discussion, our third one, on the universe and I, where science and spirituality meet? It is quite a great book, I think you'd agree, by Reverend Dr. George Dole. Pretty short for a book on spirit and physics and answering, the ultimate meaning of all things. And yet I think it might pull it off. We'll see. We're heading towards the end here. Let us know what you think in the chatzy and the forums. Email me, as many of you do. So today we are talking, as I mentioned, about chapters 4 and 5. And if you want to call in and chat, you don't even have to talk very much. You can just say, like I often want to do. You can call. Our call-in number is 646-564-9571. And I'll try to pay attention to anyone calling in and make sure I put you on air, at least to check in if you want to talk or not. So today, our first chapter is called, and maybe you can help me discern the meaning of this title, Ignorance plus Observations plus Emergence equals Model. So that's the title of chapter 4. And, a lot of those words have come up already, but I'm not sure how they fit together. Let's think about this. Ignorance. So we're all pretty much ignorant, plus what we take in. The basis of all scientific reasoning, plus emergence equals model. Let's see if we can parse that. So this chapter starts off by saying, given the many perspectives of the emergence of life in the previous chapter, Swedenborg's statement, to be actually is by means of to emerge, to be actually is by means of to emerge, may be taken as both a personal and a cosmogonic statement. I am, in a sense, a reflection of the Big Bang. This phrase resolves very readily into Swim and Tucker's statement that even from the first moments, our universe moved toward creating relationships. And it is manifest at the other end of the ongoing story of my own yearning for autonomy and yearning for inclusion. So a big theme that's developed in this book is to be is being, like continuing to act, and you can't divest the two from each other. And kind of the bigger theme in this book for Reverend Dr. George Dole, it seems, is that this deeper reality, this divinity, this ultimate, universe of providence manifests itself in the universe in these cascading developments and relationships and complications. And speaking of relationships, I hope you all are doing well in the chatzy. This community is an affirming interfaith community based on a mystical Christianity called Swedenborgianism. Many people who call themselves Swedenborgian aren't necessarily Christian. We just had an interview with Reverend Junchol Lee, who considers himself a Taoist Buddhist Swedenborgian. So we welcome all atheists, non-believers, etc. alike in this community. Please connect with us and on our website, Swedenborgiancommunity.org, if you want to have your voice heard, especially in this discussion. On the next page, Reverend George Dole reflects on a joke. He says, there is a very old joke about a contractor who asks some clients whether they want their house built from the top down or from the bottom up. When they say from the bottom up, obviously, he responds, dang it, I'll have to tear the whole thing down and start over. Yes, the universe seems to have been built from the bottom up, but that does not mean that the foundation should be taken as the cause and explanation of the house. Rather, the creative intent of the whole is the cause of the design of the foundation and everything that is built upon it, step by step by step. Yeah, so he's kind of leaning into something that many scientists don't really acknowledge directly, and that there is this apparent cause in creation, at least for him, where there's an intent to creation, and that everything that comes before in this beautiful emerging universe is kind of a type and setting for this deeper intent. And we can discern some of this intent from looking at the universe and what's been going on. And of course, for him, being a Swedenborgian minister, he believes in a divinity that is creating all of this for greater community, greater connection, through diversity and plurality. So, all these different substances, all these different beings, nature, etc., in all its diversity and beauty, is for a purpose, and a key part of that purpose is just that diversity and beauty and these uplifting relationships in all their many guises. He goes on to say, the balance between expansion and contraction is so precise and delicate that it expresses itself at every most minute step of the way. And that's another way of phrasing this overarching theme he's been highlighting, which is this tendency for differentiation and then kind of a use for universal connection. And he's putting it as expansion and contraction, kind of a balance between those. And of course, that is also connecting with the fact that the universe is expanding. And, we weren't sure for a long time in physics whether or not it was expanding so quickly that, it'll just keep expanding forever, and maybe things will, fall apart. They're clearly not falling apart. Or it's slowing, but it seems as though there's this almost perfect balance between all its tendencies to that it expands in such a way that things are continuing to unfold and come together in these beautiful ways, of course thanks to the help of gravity, etc. And yet still the universe, the major elements are getting further and further apart, which we've discerned in physics through looking at the microwave, or the red shift of the universe. We just notice that things are getting further and further away from us, especially the further they are already, and that's speeding up, and yet somehow these beautiful things are still continuing to develop. So I'm going to connect with you all in the chatty for a moment before I continue, just to see if there are any thoughts being shared. Albert says, quotes, the ongoing story of my own yearning for autonomy and yearning for inclusion, it can be seen in the Buddha and in Hitler. It is vividly imaged in Harpo Marx and in Helen Keller. Yeah, thank you, Albert. That's connecting this theme of, how's it put, expansion and contraction to the personal level, where we each kind of have this impulse for autonomy and also yearning for inclusion. So you may wonder sometimes, or you may grapple sometimes, like, why am I dealing with this feeling that I really want to be on my own and disconnect, and et cetera, in all its different ways, and yet we also grapple with the feeling, this motive and feeling to connect further, and we all, I think, have kind of like the awareness that there's something beautiful in this wider connection, and yet sometimes we grapple for where it is. Sometimes our connections aren't always uplifting. I know a lot of relationships can be hurtful at times, but I think we're all in a deeper connection and community, whether or not we know it, and we can lean into the health that we have in our most obvious relationships, just in a sense to further the point of the universe, maybe? No, just to also uplift our joy and the joy of those around us. And the more we don't isolate ourselves purely and kind of focus on the selfish part of this, I think the more we can kind of open up in healthy ways and uplift others, recognizing that the source of all this is the same. We have a lot of gifts, even if I think we can all acknowledge that, even if we're not a believer in God, Sophia. I think we can acknowledge that there's a lot of things that we receive from the world around us, the greater structure of the universe, and how beautiful things have gone for whatever reason in this universe. And Albert also mentions the importance of knowing biographies in reference to all those kind of heavy names that George Dole dropped in that quote: Buddha and Hitler, Harpo Marx and Helen Keller. I had this interesting conversation the other day about Hitler, and it came up that, wouldn't you hope that Hitler is in heaven? I wonder what your reaction to that phrase is, I think I would hope that even Hitler can change his motivations and reconnect with divinity. And maybe it was a long process, probably, given the unfathomable horrors that this person helped cause. And yet, I think we should hope he's in heaven, connecting with others in diversity. He probably doesn't know he's Hitler, if he is. Not to go too far into asides, but speaking of famous people, Swedenborg talks about how famous people in heaven, especially if they have a big following, either often don't know that they're that person anymore, so that they don't get too caught up in fame before they're ready, or they're kind of disconnected with people who would react to their name. I think it's kind of interesting, examples, descriptions given by Swedenborg. So on the next page, page 49, if you have this copy of the book, which is, I think, the main paper copy, George Dole says, we should then expect to find this fire at work, and he's talking about the fire of kind of the cause of creation, in the building of the atomic table, in the compounding of atoms into increasingly complex molecules and chemical reactions, in the formation of stars and planets, the latter culminating in molecules and habitats of sufficient complexity to manifest life and observable agency. So he highlights observable agency because to him, he sees, of course, agency in all these things. First in sensitive cells, then in plants, and then communicative and cooperative insects, in the ongoing evolution of more and more complex forms of life with increasingly varied and subtle forms of consciousness and perceptions. So I'm curious, for those listening in the chat, where do you see Swedenborg in this kind of idea of this agency throughout all creation? I know we talked about it a number of times, so forgive me for reconnecting with some things we have videos on. But divine providence is kind of a major theme for Swedenborg, and how even though God knows all things and is all powerful, there's this thing called freedom in creation that allows for evil and these kind of destructive things to happen, even though the arc of history, as Martin Luther King so famously put, is towards justice. And of course, I think he actually got that idea from someone else. I forget their name. But yeah, so how do these things relate to your spirituality? If you're not Swedenborgian, do you see providence in all things? Is there freedom? Is quantum physics an image of freedom, perhaps? All right, let's continue going here. Surely we have every reason not to believe that the fire has reached the end of the line. It all sounds irresistibly fractal. And that's a big thing in physics too, is the fractal nature of creation. Kind of the microcosm is an image of the macrocosm. And it's kind of beautiful in that way, that we can see learn something about ourselves and the greater universe. I remember this this study that came out that was from, I think, UC San Diego, and they put a bunch of just details, physics of laws, I think, of the kind of the macro universe into a supercomputer, and they started just looking for correlations of anything, like just, okay, you're smart, computer, please relate these ideas, these formulas, etc., to whatever you find out in literature, out in research. And it's interesting, they weren't expecting results so quickly. I remember them highlighting in the results of the study, and they found that the macro universe on a major scale is highly correlated with how the human brain works. And of course they had to well, maybe we should sit on that idea for a second, just to digest it. But they had to kind of point out that, oh, we're not trying to say that the universe creates brains and that the universe is a giant brain intentionally or anything like that. And yet here's this high correlation that, our brains, human brains, have kind of macro tendencies that are parallel to the macro tendencies of the universe on a high level. It's kind of amazing. So to finish out this page, at every stage and on every scale, we can observe or intuit the same tension between differentiation and integration, with the story of evolution being the story of the progressive self-manifestation of the creative nature and power of life. Yeah, so the universe is God expressing herself. There you go. Jumping a couple pages, 51. He touches on free will and determinism here, and he kind of points out, if you're all in the free will camp, you can't, to insist that we can overcome all our limitations by sheer willpower is to claim omnipotence. I wouldn't necessarily agree with that, but let's see where he's going with this. And then the claim that we bear no responsibility because we are nothing more than products of our circumstances is a shameless evasion of responsibility. So he's trying to highlight that, okay, it's a mix of free will and determinism. You have free will, but then you're stuck in a room, so you can only do so many things. Your body is a certain way, physics are a certain way, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's like free will with limitation, which I guess in a sense, you tell me, is he paralleling free will and determinism with universal kind of wider freedom or community and, isolation principles? Like the more isolated you are, the more deterministic, and determinism really is just limitation. You couldn't really have anything without free will. So in a sense, although we grapple with our individualization and we feel empowered by it, I think there's something to realizing that even in that individualization, whatever the word is, we are empowered by the greater whole and by divinity, because otherwise we're just focusing on a limiting factor, even if we feel like it's empowering, because often we're selfish and self-oriented, so it feels really good just to focus on our self-gratification. Interesting. Okay. And he says further, we are the creative interaction between our need for identity and our need to belong. And for some people, of course, a lot of village tribes would say feeling, being involved in community and belonging is how they gain their identity. A lot of people do say also that we can only know ourselves through other people, and of course we wouldn't have a language if not for other people. We can relate to someone he mentioned a page or two ago, Helen Keller, and despite our ideas that humanity we're just like special to the infinite degree over everything else, as we know, a lot of it we learn, a lot of it is in culture. Helen Keller said that she felt kind of a bestial nature within herself with no real rhyme or reason until she first grasped meaning, like that someone was trying to share meaning with her, and just the idea of conversation, of relation, and meaning with that relation kind of broke those doors down of, this higher thinking that she, of course, leaned into in all her beautiful work. And especially her social justice work, which isn't talked about much, but I'll let you read that about that on your own time. Okay, so further here, paradox breeds uncertainty, which is fertile ground for change and therefore for process. Looking again at the big picture, P.W. Anderson notes at each stage entirely new laws, concepts, and generalizations are necessary. For 14 billion years, though, the basic direction of evolution toward increasing complexity and coherence has remained constant. Yeah, a lot of riffing from George Dole, but highlighting it in different ways, given the the subject, the chapter, but also kind of emphasizing again, it's not just chaotic, it's not just all falling apart, as a lot of physicists will mention for whatever reason. I think he goes more into this in another way further on in this chapter. Next page, he says, the emergence of life is creativity showing itself more clearly. After providing suggestive hints, creativity has come out of the closet by constructing a universe of complexity capable of its undeniable self-disclosure. And while this makes Anthropos simply the most adequate representation of that creative tension thus far manifested, as far as we can see, it may also remind us that Anthropos is capable of radical uncreativity. And he's highlighting how, although life seems to be kind of the ultimate expression of creativity, it's interesting. Ultimate expression of creativity is in the human form. I think he highlights that a few times in kind of Swedenborgian thought later. It's also really capable of destruction. Yeah. And then further down the page, he says, referring against Einstein's three alternative views, I would see us as being presented with a choice between trying to overcome what we interpret as a hostile environment, gambling to take advantage of a haphazard one, or learning to cooperate with a challenging and profoundly friendly one. This model indicates that the whole tendency of the creativity of the universe is in the third direction. Yeah, so again, this universe is more friendly than we know, and I think he spends the next couple pages, and we'll just touch on it briefly, kind of highlighting how Darwin at times highlights this cooperative nature of creation, how all things kind of work within their setting, depending on all the things around it. But then sometimes uses kind of a blunt statement, which takes a little bit of interpretation, I think, where he says, so the strong survive. And that's kind of what's, mainly quoted from Darwin. And yet, George Dole problematizes the phrasing in a purely literal reading without, kind of taking each term in the context of what Darwin was talking about. Because clearly Darwin is saying, okay, not the strongest as in the one most able to lift something up, but the one that fits within its context so well that it is in cooperation and with the things around it in such a degree that it's more able to thrive. And I think George Dole here really wants to emphasize these highlights of Darwin on community, of how really it comes back to community, even though there is death and there is destruction and there is an element of, something fits better in an environment, it survives. A lot of times it's really weak things that are surviving, like butterflies, et cetera, not because they're, the strongest physically, but that in a sense they're strongest in community. So leaning into community and connection is actually Darwinian evolution. I think is kind of the point that he starts trying to get into in the next couple pages with Darwin, highlighting kind of Darwin's mixed messaging and a kind of a literal reading with kind of straightforward definitions of the terms he uses. And then, he says this thing on the next page, it's pretty cool, where Darwin is actually saying, it may metaphorically be said that natural selection is daily and hourly scrutinizing throughout the world the slightest variations, rejecting those that are bad, preserving those that are good, silently and intensively working whenever and wherever opportunity offers at the improvement of each organic being in relation to its organic and inorganic conditions of life. key being there in relation to those things. And then George Dole says, I find this startling, even inspiring. It is Darwin beholding the face of nature bright with gladness and the superabundance of food. Both quotes. It has a very personal tone that is quintessentially optimistic. It could serve as a description of Kaufmann's creativity, as we were talking about, or for that matter of Swedenborg's divine providence. It portrays natural selection as conscious and purposeful, and as always and everywhere, working for the best. It seems that even though the evidence keeps telling Darwin that the overall process is relentlessly constructive, he is particularly tuned into destructive events and has a knee-jerk negative reaction to the thought of death. This optimistic view is a metaphor, yes, but he has already warned the reader that he uses the phrase struggle for existence in a large and metaphorical sense. This is also Darwin, in a large and metaphorical sense, including dependence of one being upon another. So this struggle is, okay, that's an interesting thing to relate to our own lives. So this struggle is including the dependence that we have on all other things. So in a sense, you could say the struggle is as a whole, the whole thing together, independence of itself, each other, in cooperation, moves forward and emerges. In other words, I would say. That's interesting to think about it that way. And I want to check on the chat see again. Okay, okay, good. I'm glad you can still hear me. Hey, David. How's it going? Thanks for joining. Thank you all for connecting in the chat see. I hope you all are doing well. Not to lose sight of the purpose of this conversation, or to keep it in sight, it really is about community. I mean, that's what George Dole is saying. It's about being willing to acknowledge that we are in connection, and that the struggle doesn't have to be purely isolationist. And in fact, even Darwin was saying that it's in the wider community that these things exist and go forward. And there is death, there is change towards greater and greater, you could say, community. And you could say survivability in a sense, but all things die, which is the thing that that George Dole highlights further on in this chapter. So on the next page, life and death must be seen as intimately interactive and interdependent. So if there's growth, there has to be space to accommodate the supply of life. So there's a dynamic between life and death that's inescapable, is kind of what George Dole is saying here. And he says predatory creatures do tend to cull the herds of their prey, but if they are too successful, their supply of prey becomes so scarce that their own survival becomes threatened. The effects of overgrazing can be lethal to the grazers. And I don't think I highlighted it here, but George Dole also highlights how it's a lot easier to view a lot of predators in like a resting state, in family state, than it is catching the thing that it eats. I thought that was an interesting thing to point out. And so he says on the next page, this walk is not simply cyclical, it makes progress, kind of the walk of evolution of life. If we look at the biosphere as a single system, it is quite clear that its repetitive dialogue between anabolism and catabolism has tended to nourish sentience. And the more sentient feed on the less sentient. Plants, in fact, feed on the lifeless, as he says. Although you would think when he says lifeless, and he talks about minerals that plants are feeding off of, and elements, he'd put it in quotes, right? But that's not here or there. And then he says, as noted just above, Darwin does state quite unequivocally that the ultimate result, this is a quote from Darwin, is that each creature, or better, each species, George Dole adds, tends to become more and more improved in relation to its conditions. And he adds that this improvement inevitably leads to the gradual advancement of the organization of the greater number of living beings throughout the world. Darwin adds that. Yeah. So as we were saying, it's all about community. And he says, buried in the middle of the origin of species, though, is that blunt, unqualified statement that the general law leading to the advancement of all species is multiply, vary, let the greatest live and the weakest die. And then he has in the footnotes, this statement comes at the close of his chapter on instinct, with its insistence that the instinct of each species is good for itself, but has never, as far as we can judge, been produced for the exclusive good of others. However, that chapter also includes a description of so-called slave-making ants, so this is kind of interesting, who are so utterly helpless that when Huber shut up 30 of them without a slave, but with plenty of the food which they like best, and with their own larvae and pupae to stimulate them to work, they did nothing. They could not even feed themselves, and many perished of hunger. Huber then introduced a single slave, and she instantly set to work, fed and saved the survivors, made some cells and tended the larvae, and put all to rights. Here, the strong seem to exist, if not exclusively, still certainly primarily to serve the weak. Page 55, yeah. Now we're on 56. Thanks for the clarification in the chat, see. Actually, we're on 57. So he says, I find the phrase in relation to its conditions to be saying that the universe is profoundly moral. So this is, again, in relation to Darwin, appreciating differences and blending them into cooperative activity. I mean, I could agree with that. Is that a moral element, appreciating differences and blending them into cooperative activity? You could say that's a more moral element, I guess. Not sure. I'm curious what you all think about that. I take this personally, he says, it is little short of absurd for me to insist on my right to be the distinctive individual that I undoubtedly am. That experience tells me leads to my perceiving others as competing for that right. No, it is actually my responsibility to be that individual, to differentiate myself, so to speak, and to try to discern what is unique about me. Only by doing so can I discover what I'm good for, where my individuality best fits into the overall fabric of human community. This means that I must find what my limitations are. Yeah, so he's saying that, okay, learn more about yourself as an individual, accept it as you, as kind of your responsibility so that you can better connect with others. And he goes on to talk about, if you're a species that can really differentiate its output, its gift to the world, then you're probably more likely to survive in relation to the world. In kind of economic terms, which my undergrad, one of my majors was economics, and it's talked about a lot, or at least in my degree program, kind of differentiating your skill set as a country allows you to maximize profits on the supply-demand intersection graph. If you can do something better because of your environment, your people, your technology, then you can charge more because, it costs you less. So you actually may charge less overall than everyone else would, and yet still gain a surplus from it. Interesting that these things are all relatable, I guess. Jumping ahead to 59, he talks about Einstein and how Einstein, it's an interesting quote from Einstein, intimated that there is, quote, an intelligence of such superiority that, compared with it, all the systematic thinking and acting of human beings is an utterly insignificant reflection. So Einstein thought there was like an Einstein behind the universe. Thought that there was more higher Einstein in creation, or at least reflected on it. It'd be interesting to look that up. That's from the book The World as I See It. Could be a essay as well. So he also says, while theologians should listen to the anti-theists who tell them that the gods their minds construct are totally inadequate to account for the universe. So he's saying theologians should listen to anti-theists, relating that our gods don't measure up, okay? Anti-theists should also listen to those theologians who've been trying to tell us this for 2 or 3 millennia. So yeah, often when we talk about religion in society, it's kind of the straw man religion, especially Christianity. It's like the fundamentalist creationist view of Christianity is the one that's always debunked, right? Because often, if we were to go deeper and with kind of, let's say, heavier, I would think more accurate theologians, a little bit more reflective theologians, we'd have to grapple with more because they say more about what seems to actually be going on, and it's not this, oh, but just believe it. You were created immediately with the snap of a fingers. Don't argue. Don't look at science. Science is the enemy. Also, God only cares about you and your folks. Everyone else is going to hell. That's kind of the too strict and narrow idea of God that I think many of us, hopefully are evolving from, I would think. Albert, thanks, Albert, for all your great comments. Albert mentions, at the same time, cooperation itself depends on differentiation. This is a quote from the book. Remember 1 Corinthians 12:17. If the whole body were an eye, where would the hearing be? In the highly compact terms of Swedenborgian theology, a form makes a unity more perfectly as its constituents are distinguishably different and yet united. Yes, and this is something we've highlighted in other phrasing before, but there is a tendency in creation to diversity, for diversification, for plurality, even interfaith, you could call it. Although in a sense it's all one, although there's so many ways of approaching it that it seems multicolored. And in fact, that diversity leads to perfection and more unity, according to Swedenborg, which is what Albert was quoting through quote through George Dole. Thanks again. And then I think this idea kind of relates to a lot of what he goes into further on in this chapter, which is about the human body and how every element of the human body has its own tendencies, its own purpose, and yet without all these things doing different tasks, having different purposes in a sense, maybe the same higher purpose, you wouldn't have the perfection and beauty of the human body. Of course, I think he also, in the next couple pages, relates these things to Swedenborg's view of heaven, and actually says that all like good ideas, all goodness, in a sense, is in a human form, in kind of the highest idea of what humanity could be, a humane form, and that humane form is something that we receive from divinity. So in fact, we don't create God in the image of a person because we're so much about ourselves, but that actually we are an image of the supreme personality of the Godhead, of the higher power, of Sophia, of Christ, and that as we lean into the goodness that we receive, the community, this emerging reality, even in our own, you could say somewhat limited point of view, the more we receive from divinity, the healthier we can become if we're willing to, healthier we can uplift other people in diversity, in plurality. And it's really cool, actually. I was going to skip these pages, having kind of summarized them, but he highlights this quote from Lewis Thomas, I believe, who talks about how like certain elements of the human body are like they are, according to Lewis Thomas, like their own being. They're just kind of like bacteria, not trapped, but in a ecosystem that they just thrive in within a cell. So he actually relates, what is it exactly? I'll just read the phrase, the quote. "We are not made up as we had always supposed of successively enriched packets of our own parts. We are shared, rented, occupied." This is not even getting into how much we rely on bacteria that we would define as bacteria. Further, he says, "At the interior of our cells, driving them, providing the oxidative energy that sends us out for the improvement of each shining day, are the mitochondria." That's it. And in a strict sense, they are not ours. They turn out to be little separate creatures. The colonial posterity of migrant prokaryocytes probably primitive bacteria that swam into ancestral precursors of our eukaryotic cells and stayed there. Ever since, they have maintained themselves in their ways, replicating in their own fashion, privately, with their own DNA and RNA quite different from ours. I didn't know that. So mitochondria kind of have their own blueprints for themselves exclusively. That's be interesting to learn more about. They are as much symbionts, with an N, as the rhizobial bacteria in the roots of beans. Without them, we would not move a muscle, drum a finger, or think a thought. Yes. Well put. So our bodies, this thing that we call a self, maybe even our consciousness, is that possible? Despite seeming like a unity, is actually a community. Oh, that's weird. George Dole never really relates this, but this is connecting to something within Swedenborgian thought for me, where Swedenborg likes to highlight how every spirit can't exist without being in spiritual community with other already living, existing spirits, both in this world, this universe, and the next, or the underlying one, I should say. And you couldn't think a thought without being in community. In fact, the things that go through your head, although are kind of original to you in the way they appear and the way they come together, they are elements of other spirits. And as we change our intentions, our motivations, our heart, our relation to these spirits changes, so we become in connection with different spirits. But still, without those other spirits connecting with us, and then the Lord, of course, the Lady, connecting directly and also indirectly through this entire community, expressing herself in emergent fashion, you could say, we would not think a thought. We could not exist. So it's interesting to think, okay, so my body is made up of community, very, observably so in our science today, and then maybe my consciousness is too. And so even when I feel alone, I'm in community, and I should think about what kind of community I want to foster in my head. And in a sense, that also relates to the fact, that Swedenborg said that we receive all these things, not just in community, but from divinity, especially our goodness, even our evil, destructive things that we do. We receive the life energy, the heat, from divinity originally, and we just decide to use it in a destructive fashion, in that freedom that I think quantum physics and every other level of creation allows for within our spirit and mind. Thoughts to ponder. I'm curious what you all think. Mark highlights something on page 63. Britain's empire, which far more relied on economic strength and often included idealistic, heuristic goal of bringing the presumed benefits of civilization to the benighted, had its beginnings in the 15th century and drew to a close in the 20th, with Britain at that time being one of the military victors over Germany. Yeah, so I think that's part of, you say, which is important to understand how E.S. wrote and in what context. Oh, that's a good point. Swedenborg was 18th century, kind of had a certain idea about things, even though he says that the Lord opened his spiritual eyes and he could see the spiritual realm, and God told him, write about it. He still had his own context. Swedenborg's still a person, limited, differentiated, leaning into community person, and had his context. So that's good to remember about Swedenborg, actually, something to highlight. And also that comes in the section of the book where he's talking about how, might doesn't always make right and isn't always the quintessential thing in the universe. And I think he says something else about that, but I'll get to that in a moment. So on page 61, George Dole says, so this is saying that it is not only possible but supremely practical to compete for the sake of cooperation rather than to cooperate for the sake of competition, not just on a personal scale but also on a global, ultimate scale. And he says this reverse prioritization to how we usually think about it, perhaps, is crucial, and that it would seem to call for a development of a sharp sense of empathy that has a global reach. Well, that'd be nice, right? A kind of planetary consciousness and ordering of Thomas's Plankton. Now, that isn't to say we need a one world government or anything like that, but that it would be nice if the world, in all its diversity and all its different cultures, had a kind of a shared sense of purpose, which is more community, more joy, more health in our diversity as it comes up for each of us in our freedom and our organic living, and our relating with each other, kind of shedding the more destructive things and finding this deeper purpose, even on a global scale, but also on a personal scale. And that these reflections from Darwin and all these physicists and others kind of highlights that we should compete for the sake of cooperation. So not even really competition in this, okay, I got to be better than everyone type of way, but hey, I'm going to try to do this as best I can. It seems to be my niche, so I can help these people out, even the people that turns out I'm better at this thing at, so they do something else maybe they keep doing it, maybe we find symbiosis that we didn't know we could find before. So I think that's pretty cool. Good highlight from George Dole. David says he guessed Dole is trying hard to bridge Swedenborg to modern materialist science. Yes, I think that's kind of a big theme. Well put. By juxtaposing some Swedenborg quotes with quantum physics and Darwinism. Yeah, I guess so. Or is he actually a disciple of materialist science? I don't think George Dole is, but I'll continue reading your comment here. He sure doesn't seem like an actual Swedenborgian. I can't even be sure he believes in God in Swedenborg's terms. But maybe he's just trying hard to not alienate himself from people who are offended by a personal God. I think, yeah, that's probably part of it. Like George Dole, I talked to George Dole about this. It'll be an interview in an upcoming series with the Swedenborg Foundation called The Transcendients, but you may have to wait a month or two for that. And he said that he did try to make this digestible for the masses. So a lot of the people he quotes, a lot of the books he got inspired by, a lot of the things in the bibliography are these kind of mainstream physics and science books, mainstream quote unquote, because a lot of them, still only reached a limited audience. And so he's trying to enter this dialogue of like popular science, quantum physics on real terms. He doesn't just have lip service to it. I think. Hope that's what you've been getting too from reading through this. So I think he does phrase things in a way that he would think is more digestible to a bunch of people. I do that too often. I wouldn't personally use the term the universe maybe in like my journal or something, but I think that's a perfectly adequate term for a lot of people, because a lot of people will use the phrase the universe in a providential light, and maybe in other sentences they'll say, well, the universe has it doesn't have sentience. But then you find in a lot of their living they kind of lean into this idea that there is a providence, the universe is a good place, and I think that's more at the core of how we often live than the dismissive terms we sometimes use, because I think we're healing from a lot of bad religion, a lot of bad theology, and so in kind of a purely like descriptory way, we dismiss a lot of the things that those religions, those bad theologies highlighted, not necessarily the bad parts of them. Often some other parts were really kind of destructive, maybe the everyone but us six are going to hell parts. But then we end up just dismissing even these details because it doesn't seem to fit into a cohesive whole. And often the religion dismisses science entirely. And so, we hear these ideas that doesn't make any sense. It's like, okay, your God doesn't make any sense. So why would I think that God's providential? And how do you explain evil? And, loving God, but, get their son's name wrong, you're going to hell, all those things don't sit well with people. And so I think a lot of times we kind of dismiss the terminology, the phrasing, and yet somehow it still kind of comes back into our lives because it's so vital and strong and beautiful, and it can go by a lot of different phrases. It really can, and we're still connecting with the same higher power in our own way, even if that phrase is anathema to us. So thank you. Did I finish that? If you call yourself Swedenborgian, David says, own the whole shebang, George. Nice. See, that reminds me of George in the Footnotes, where he gets a little quippy. That's awesome. I love that. As I read Swedenborg, he shows the materialist science perspective to be nonsense. Dole quotes Divine Love and Wisdom on page 69 on page 86, but did he actually read it? Well, if you look at your copy of Divine Love and Wisdom from the Swedenborg Foundation, it was probably, I think it was translated by George Dole from Latin. So he read it. So let's give him a benefit of the doubt. I get what you're saying here. Let's talk more about it. George Dole, is he Swedenborgian? I'm curious what you think. Let's see if the rest of this chapter sheds any light on it. I thought, speaking of footnote quotes, quips and quotes, George Dole says on 63 something kind of interesting in relation to these powers, major powers in the world, certainly shifting. He says, I was in grade school during much of World War II, and if anyone had told me that Germany and Japan, the Nazis and the Japs, would during my own lifetime become two of our most reliable allies, I would have doubted their sanity. It would have seemed tantamount to treason. Yeah, it's kind of crazy how things can change over time. Jumping ahead to 65, George Dole is quoting Stuart Kaufman, and he's connecting with this idea that we hear in a lot of New Age thought of the global mind. And Kaufman says, is it then more amazing to think that an Abrahamic, transcendent, omnipotent, omniscient God created everything around us, all that we participate in 6 days? Again, straw man, creationism, or that it all arose with no transcendent creator God, all on its own. I believe the latter is so stunning, so overwhelming, so worthy of all gratitude and respect, that it is God enough for many of us. So he's saying no God is God enough for many of us. Just this, how these things are so great. This is Stuart Kaufman. God, a fully natural God, is the very creativity in the universe. It is this view that I hope can be shared across all religious traditions, Kaufman says, embracing those like myself. I hope to. Sometimes we can have differings of opinion. It's okay to uplift those things. I think that's great. And he says, who do not believe in a creator God, as well as those who do. Emphasis, George Dole's. So, okay, I think this relates to what you were relating, David. Thanks again for such a beautiful reflection. Because George Dole responds to this. So this person's saying, God creates stuff out of nothing, 6 days, not having it. Nature as God is the way to be, is what Stuart Kaufman's saying. And then George Dole says in response, I suspect that by transcendent, Kaufman means non-material or unnatural, because Kaufman dismisses transcendent God. Since the word in this context is commonly used to mean not of this world. I think that's reasonable. He says, if I agree with him in his rejection of God as person, it is only on the grounds that common concepts of person are inadequate precisely because they are not transcendent, are in fact based in nature. I think that's George Dole highlighting his belief in God as like a person, but ultimate personhood. He goes further to say, I believe that transcendence in this case points towards a source that is not so much impersonal, so not an impersonal God, as it is superpersonal, metapersonal. So really cares about you, really is here with us now, knowing more about you and everything about your face, your mind, your intentions, your future, than anyone else, and trying to maximize kind of your future joy and connection, as well as the wholes. He says, I believe that transcendence in this case points towards the source, is not so much impersonal as superpersonal, metapersonal. If it is to be worthy of all, as Kaufman puts the natural quote-unquote natural God, must it not be at least felt as transcendent? So he's saying, okay, so Kaufman, if you're saying this creation and the emergence of creation is so worthy of all, then shouldn't be at least felt as transcendent? Like, shouldn't that fit with the definition of transcendent, worthy of all? What else could it be to be awe-inspiring? So again, George Dole's kind of tackling the language here. The language used to usually dismiss religion, especially kind of, religion with things that we totally dismiss, like most of us do, 6 days of creation, etc. At least not, at least as a purely physical creation story, not a metaphorical spiritual creation story. As Swedenborg would say, the 7 days of creation are the image of human development, spiritual development. So if you're dismissing a transcendent God, do you actually mean that? And he's saying, well, it sounds like you think this natural emergence is transcendently awesome, and you're calling it God. So hey, maybe we can agree on something here. That's funny. And he says it can hardly be subpersonal if it's awe-inspiring. That's interesting. George, I don't know if I'm totally buying into what you're saying here, but I think that you're onto something here. Later down on the page, he says the terms natural and spiritual are often set in contrast with each other. But if by natural Kaufman is referring to something that is comprehensible and that makes consistent sense, then the spiritual reality I find portrayed by Swedenborg is not unnatural in the least. Now, I would agree with that. I think it's kind of relating to what we were talking about a moment ago. Often in religion, we find these stories, these descriptions of reality, of cosmology, cosmogony, still don't know how to say that word, homogeny, that don't make a lot of sense. And yet, for me, and apparently for George Dole as well, when I was introduced to Swedenborgian ideas, when I was kind of ready for them, I didn't believe in God most of my young life, it really made sense. It actually seemed to fit with what I loved about science and physics, which is why this book is so exciting for me, perhaps. Hope it's exciting for you too. And it's natural in the sense that it makes sense. It fits with how things seem to be working. Even our experiences, we were talking about near-death experiences in our Sunday multimedia service, which you can read. Also the video podcast, blog talk radio show that we did, which you can find both on Swedenborgiancommunity.org. And I think actually that's a good segue into where he's going, because he starts touching on near-death experiences and how, for a lot of people, there is a certain spiritual reality that can fit within their idea of natural reality. It doesn't have to be differentiated kind of as definition. And I think often that's how these arguments or these disagreements go, because most disagreements, no matter how heated, kind of center on like definition of words. It could just be like, okay, we have the definition, we don't mean the same thing, so we're arguing. It could also mean I call myself Muslim, I call myself Christian, we think that's different, so we're arguing. Often it's around disagreements, and also this kind of tendency to raise ourselves up on a platter and destroy everything else, which I think is taking this differentiation method to a negative degree, at odds with evolution, at odds with the emergence of this universe and how things have been going, at odds with how our body works, how differentiation, diversification leads to beauty, heavenly society, and community. So, skipping ahead into chapter 5, this is a really short chapter. So we're on the first page of that chapter called The Universe Within. He relates this thing that he mentions in the first chapter already, from Steven Pinker, who says that the hard problem is explaining how subjective experience arises from neurocomputation. And he kind of delves into this idea of how, our minds, our brains are super complicated. There's like tens of thousands of neurons, like on one cell head. I don't know. It's like something amazing. Um, I remember I saw this picture once of like all the neuronal chemical, I think it was all the chemical markers and pieces of the head of a neuron. And it was like, it looked like a brain itself. There's like so many things on that one neuron. I'm like, is that real? Like, that's one neuron. There's all this stuff going on, not just like the electric transfer, but all this other stuff going on. It's like amazing. So he goes through a lot of these descriptions, and also some relays some examples, and highlights how it seems like it's not as simple as, okay, our brain gives forth to consciousness. In fact, there's some indicators that consciousness is kind of like this underlying thing in creation, and our brain and consciousness within all things relate to each other in a sense, and consciousness kind of pushes brain forward, kind of allows it to do its thing. And that there's actually, I forget who he quotes here at some point, but he highlights this idea that there are places in the brain where it seems like there's this quantum interaction, or this place where we could be receiving these kind of conscious indicators from the, the underlying reality, the universe, quantum physics, etc. I'm trying to summarize. You can read the chapter yourself. And it's kind of, I think it's cool because, those are things we hear hinted at all the time, and kind of makes sense that, okay, quantum physics is a real thing, whether, at least as far as most of us are concerned, whether or not we believe in God. So how does our brain seem to relate to quantum physics? And it seems like there could be this deep coupling that could allow for this kind of transcendent, awe-inspiring consciousness that we each have, and connection that we each have. And then we also know there's these interesting qualities within quantum physics around connections. And then it almost becomes mind-blowing just going through the laws of the brain and physics itself on a very, very superficial, you could say, level, that, hey, maybe Kaufman's right. I can look at nature and see God, the transcendent God, even though he doesn't like that phrase. and I can connect with divinity's purpose and beauty, even if I wouldn't call it purpose, just like, oh, this is the way things are going, But there's something amazing here, and we can feel joy about it. We can have gratitude towards it, towards our community, towards the community that is us, the community that is around us, and lean into it. That's what evolution is actually about. That's what Swedenborgianism, I think a lot of faiths are about. So that's cool. Let's see if we have a place to land within here. So speaking of materialist stuff, David, on page 70 he says, something had happened that had no explanation under a strictly materialist dogma, something far too closely and clinically observed to be dismissed simply on the a priori or prima facie grounds that it could not be true. Something called Pamela Reynolds responded to oral and visual stimuli when the neurons of Pamela Reynolds' brain did not. And that's connecting with the near-death experiences, and how he highlights this one example, but how there are people, documented cases, a lot of anecdotal things where someone was brain dead, like at least their neurons were firing, their heart had stopped, and yet they remember what was happening in the room. And then in Pamela Reynolds' case, not only that, but she was in an EEG with as loud as a jet combustion engine, and I think her brain had stopped. Yeah, her brain had stopped working. The neurons weren't firing, and she was able to quote what the doctors were saying during that, in a documented case. I mean, okay, so it's one example. Could be something, something could be off about it. Who knows? But I think a lot of people have these near-death experiences that speak to something deeper, something greater, that by definition, at least in a human experience perspective, fits within the natural order of things, even if it's just in our heads, somehow doing these amazing things where it's hearing, seeing things that are outside of its pure view. But also just like this phenomenon of near-death experiences of seeing an afterlife is occurs around the world, and I think George Dole says 200,000 people a year in this country have that experience. He quotes some source. What is it? Epoch Times. By the something about near-death experience by the numbers. Who knows where that's coming from? But we did talk about this study recently in the UK that I think like 30% of these people who had cardiac arrest had these near-death experience indicators. I think it was like 46% of stage 2 interviewees had these experiences while their heart had stopped, and 9% had like really extensive ones. Pretty amazing. A lot of people have had these experiences. How do they fit within our view of life? I know some people will dismiss them as saying, okay, our brains are just hardwired to have really trippy fantasies right before they die, right when they're dying, and yet there's no neuronal activity after cardiac arrest. And these things are really transcendent, beautiful, connecting with people who have passed. Should we just dismiss it out of hand because we say we believe in science, and so that means we dismiss things out of hand? I don't think so. Okay, I'm going to return to the Chatsi. Reality is, David says, each of us decides how we want to interpret it, of course. Yes, great point, David. You know, we interpret things through our own lens. Hopefully it's a model-dependent realism where or maybe there's a better phrase for it, but that was a phrase really popular at the beginning of this book, the appearance of truth. Hopefully we're leaning into the truth of it, not just crafting everything based on our destructive will, because we can. As you're highlighting, often we do. Even when we have a good will is being reformed, we're allowing it to, we're leaning into good practices. It's still our frame of reference, as you're highlighting, and that's really important to remember in science, in life. And if we're really just oriented towards certain things in our destructive impulses, we can craft our whole worldview around it, our own supremacy, really be assured of it in our own life. We can feel like, okay, this is clearly what's going on. I am at the top, and I can do whatever I want, and et cetera, et cetera. But that's actually like a destructive tendency, not just for other people, but ourselves, our spirit, puts us in kind of bad spiritual community, you could say. But ultimately, I think even scientific studies reveal this. The more selfish we are, the more arrogant, the less happy we are. Our body even responds by being more inflamed. Isn't that amazing? Our DNA expression changes based on how selfish we are. I remember the study, I forget where it came from, but they did like a questionnaire, like, what are your tendencies? And people who tended to be more selfish in their motivations had like different gene expressions, had more inflammation. It was almost like their body, I think the phrase they put was like punishing them for having this tendency, which in a sense, in evolutionary biology, it would make sense that evolution would say, okay, I actually value this community over the individual. The individual puts himself over the community. Guess what? Their body starts breaking down. Of course, there's anecdotal evidence to the contrary. The villain in Chinatown, etc. But some evil people live a long time. But I think it kind of all points to this higher thing, this higher tendency, you could say, whether or not you believe in God, of being healthier, being more community oriented, and uplifting health in ourselves and around us. Really is good for us and others and lends to our joy. And Swedenborg and George Dole, I think, are saying that continues into the beyond, into eternity. The present moment that is you, from your perspective, continues forever. Albert says, I was in grade school during much of World War II, and if anyone had told me that Germany... that quote. That's a great quote. Thank you, Albert. And he says, we in the United States have been a superpower for less than a single century, yet we somehow seem convinced that this is our eternal destiny. Yeah, thank you, Albert. And thanks, David, for uplifting his comment, too. Yeah, that's a great quote, and it kind of puts in better context some of that dialogue around superpowers and how we tend to, when we're dominant, we tend to think we're dominant forever. And that doesn't tend to be the case in history. All right, so I think I'm going to jump here towards the end. So there's a dismissal of reductionism as everything's explained by laws and rules, because in fact laws and rules just describe what's going on. So you can't say, well, this follows the law. The law is actually a description. It's like formula, etc. But it tends to follow this arc that we can describe in a certain way with our mathematics and our terminology, which if we're relying so much on terminology, we should be scrutinizing it. So thank you, wordsmith George Dole, for highlighting that. I hadn't thought so seriously about it before this book, which is great. And then moving further on, 76, he says, at one point in Mitchell's life, the universe and his individual consciousness had an encounter. This is Mitchell, who said he pleads for transformation of consciousness in relation to Fred Hoyle's remark, George Dole's putting in relation to it, that once we see the world from an outside perspective, like from space, there would be a transformation of consciousness, a new way of thinking about things. And maybe we could relate that to maybe looking at the wider picture from a new lens as well. And he says he invites us to realize that we and the universe are very closely allied. There is no great gulf between my own personal reflections and the Big Bang. At the heart of each is the same rich, creative tension between differentiation and integration. Each must be understood in the context of the process of becoming, the dialogue between autonomy and belonging. This is powerfully present everywhere in the universe. I think we could pretty much all agree on that one. And then heading towards the very end, the most precise telling and beautiful phrasing of this duality that has come to my attention is that of a fellow Swedenborgian by the name of John Titus. John is a wonderful human being. His beloved daughter, Alicia, I hope I'm saying that right, was a flight attendant on United Airlines Flight 175 when it was flown into the South Tower of the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001. John was devastated by the senseless loss. And the year that followed was one of grief to the point of despair. Ultimately, though, John won through to what he described as clarity of mind and a deep feeling of interconnectedness. With a clear view of the folly of ideological fanaticism and a passionate desire that no one, friend or foe, should have to suffer such bereavement. Thank you, John, for that deep reflection in the midst of your tragedy and grief. John does a lot of really wonderful work with his wife on, breaking down these barriers through their foundation. And thanks, George, for connecting with that story for us. And then finishing out, John's words are not based on scientific research or theological speculation. They are rather the fruit of personal anguish, close kin to the anguish of Mitchell. In The Social Conquest of Earth, Edward O. Wilson traces the gradual growth of cooperative behavior over the history of the human race, giving it the rather ungainly title of eusociality. I believe that John's phrase conveys the true spirit of evolution, and I believe that our survival depends on that spirit. I profoundly hope that we do not need more events like 9/11 to awaken us. I suspect, though, that we will have them, and I trust that with each such event will come greater and greater understanding, not unlike John's. Wow. Yeah. Well, those events continue today in various forms, and propagated by various entities, including probably the country that you're sitting in. Let us hope for that continuing progression towards eusociality. Thank you, George, for that reflection. And I'm going to return to the chats here real quick. Mark says that it's gene expression, not changes in the DNA. Correct. Some genes are latent, some expressed. Wonderful. Yes. Sorry if I phrased that wrong. And it's interesting that junk expression or junk DNA is not junk at all, but a vital part of gene expression, and that does shift quite a bit with our life, our apparently our intentionality, how it's being utilized. So it's quite amazing. See, we learn things over time. We think something's totally debunk and trash. We call it junk. It turns out without it, we could not exist. David also says the physical has its origin in the spiritual. Indeed, DNA is spiritually representative. Great highlight, David. Yeah, isn't it amazing that in every cell in our body, there's like a little book that helps us construct a body anew, and it's still different. DNA. It's still seeing this thing that is read, and we use that reading to construct our physical reality. Cells change what they're doing with that depending on where they are in community. If they're right on the edge of a certain expanse of so many cells, they're like, oh, I won't be part of the bone. These are stem cells. I'm something else because I'm in a different part of the community. It's kind of amazing that our body is such a beautiful metaphor for this emergent reality that tends towards community and life, uplifting each other in this wider scope of the purity, not purity alone, but the perfection of diversification and diversity. Thank you for traveling with me through that reading / discussion. If you have any other thoughts, I'll stay on the line for a couple moments and connect with you, and I'll also continue on the Chatsy afterwards. I know a lot of times it's a lot easier to do the Chatsy stuff on such a heavy topic when you're not listening to someone chat. But thank you for connecting on this. I think this book is a good way to actually kind of look at Swedenborgianism from a wider scope, especially in discussion and commentary. I know I was actually introduced to Swedenborg at a pretty early age from my father, who was into a lot of different spiritualities and religions. But it didn't sit with me. I had the yellow copy of Heaven and Hell, if some of you Swedenborgians know what I'm talking about, and never read it really, unless Dad was forcing me. And it wasn't until I had my own near-death experience, a life review, and it kind of cracked me open and caused me to reflect on my very evolutionary-oriented mindset. I was very much about physics at the time as well. And I was reflecting on kind of my worldview and even some of the things that Elon Musk and who else was talking about this? You could probably tell me. But Elon Musk talks about how we're probably in a simulation. And simulation within a simulation, right? It's this idea that if there's one intelligent life, then there's probably almost infinite, if the universe is practically infinite. And if there's any chance that intelligent life could simulate the universe, and I think from a purely kind of pre-quantum physics view, you could really imagine, yes, it's easy to simulate the universe, maybe from I know Elon Musk knows about quantum physics, so he still thinks it's easy to simulate the universe, and I did too. And okay, so if you're having beings simulating the universe, probably living for a long time if they're able to simulate a universe. I mean, come on. Probably very aware beings. What are they paying attention to in these simulations? Even if they're all paying attention to different things, eventually you would think these things would be just paying attention to life, probably, how these things develop, how life develops. It would start looking at the development of the universe, of life, as almost like an extension of itself. It wouldn't really think competitively about this life, even though this life is probably living, dying. Maybe they're still living and dying. It would think more about it as an extension of, oh, look what I made. And even if it's not a simulation, just a really aware, dominant, you could say, alien species or species in the universe may become so entrenched with material reality just to be dominant, that it just watches things evolve. It doesn't have to worry about it because it's so great at not losing or whatever. That's kind of the worldview I was coming from. And, and eventually I realized, okay, so these beings would have this deep understanding of the things around it, and it would stop being so competitive, and what would it be about, you know? And I sat with that for a while, and from there I was like, oh, whoa, like that thing would be about like life and love and connection and awareness and compassion, not things that I was necessarily thinking about before. And I was like, well, those beings would be listening to almost every conversation happening, so I could kind of talk to it. You see where I'm going with this, right? Eventually I was like, okay, well, I actually see like markers of this type of dynamism, of this compassionate community and awareness on every level of creation. And that thing's probably been around, like maybe the Big Bang has a cycle, so if it ever existed, it almost all, in a sense, it probably almost existed, because if you have a simulation with a simulation, you could have a trillion of them. That's essentially like eternity. It's like, oh, this thing always existed. That makes the most sense to me, is what I became aware of. I was like, oh, I believe in God. Wow. I never thought I'd believe in God. I got a lot of religion growing up, especially like a compassionate, kind of break the barriers God. And so it was a trip to me to eventually find Swedenborgianism in a real way later through another book on quantum physics in Swedenborg called Proving God by Ed Sylvia. And I think that did similarly to this book, but much longer journey of highlighting kind of these broader trends in Swedenborgianism, and also that it can fit with your scientific worldview and your spirituality and these things that often we differentiate and dismiss if we're on one side or the other. So thank you, Divinity, thank you, the universe, for having such a trajectory for us. I hope you have found your own beautiful journey and walk and way of relating, and we each should lean into that. Thank you for connecting with us this evening. Mark says one man's junk is another man's treasure, maybe. I think that's true. Albert says my thrift store shopping motto. Thrift store shopping is actually the name of the game. That's how you get clothing. If you get clothing some other way, stop. No, that's my 2 cents. Thanks for bearing with me. Connect with us anytime at swedenborgiancommunity.org, and go forth knowing that you are quite loved.